You're listening to Short History Shorts audio, where history speaks louder than images. The year is 340 BC. Rome, scarred but resurgent after its brutal encounters with the Gauls and the internal reforms triggered by men like Camillus, is now a city that believes in its destiny. But belief and ambition often come at a cost, and for the Latin League, a group of cities that had once fought beside Rome, intermarried with Romans, and shared civic duties for generations. The cost was autonomy. The Latin War was not just a military conflict. It was a turning point in Roman expansion. A battle not for territory, but for dominance over allies who had grown too confident, too independent, and too powerful. To understand the war, we must understand the nature of Rome's relationship with Latium in the early Republic. Since the 5th century BC, Rome and other Latin towns had been bound by the Fides Cassianum, the Cassian Treaty, a mutual defence pact signed after years of hostilities. This agreement created a coalition between Rome and the Latin League, ostensibly based on equality, shared plunder, and joint military command. For a time it worked. The Latin cities marched alongside Rome in wars against the Aequi, the Volsci, and even Etruscan enemies. But slowly, Rome's strength outpaced the rest. Its army grew in size and experience, its population swelled, and its political structure adapted to absorb more plebeian support. When Rome defeated Vaecae and repelled the Gauls, it earned not just survival, but momentum. The Latin cities, meanwhile, remained decentralized, often bickering among themselves, and increasingly nervous that Rome would no longer treat them as equals. By 340 BC, the tension boiled over. The spark was Campania. The wealthy Greek city of Capua had come under threat from the Samnites, and both Rome and the Latins had strategic interests in intervening. But when Rome signed a separate treaty with the Samnites, allowing the Samnites to attack certain Campanian territories, many Latin cities felt betrayed. They saw it as evidence that Rome now acted unilaterally, deciding the fate of central Italy without consultation. This suspicion was soon confirmed when Latin envoys approached the Roman Senate with a radical proposal: merge Rome and the Latin League into a single state with shared consuls and shared governance. This was no plea for peace. It was an attempt to level the playing field. But Rome, proud and increasingly imperial in mindset, saw the proposal as insubordination. The Senate rejected it outright. According to Livy, one Roman elder thundered that if the Latin cities wanted to be part of Rome, they would do so as subjects, not as equals. War was now inevitable. The Latin cities of Tibur, Praeneste, and others joined together in rebellion, while Campanian allies like Capua and the Samnite tribes found themselves pulled into the maelstrom. The war that followed, known simply as the Latin War, lasted from 340 to 338 BC, but its consequences would last centuries. The initial phase of the war saw Rome fielding armies that included its Samnite allies and Campanian reinforcements. The Latin forces, meanwhile, were disciplined, heavily armed, and led by experienced generals. Many of them had served alongside Romans in past campaigns. It was a civil war in everything but name. Two former allies now locked in a struggle for dominance over the same cultural and geographic space. The most famous battle came in 340 BC at the river Viceris near Mount Vesuvius. The Roman consuls that year were Titus Manlius, Torquatus, and Publius Decius Mus, both veteran commanders and symbols of Roman stoicism. Before the battle, both consuls made a fateful pact. If the gods demanded a sacrifice, one of them would offer his life for victory. During the clash, Decius Mus, witnessing his men faltering, performed the ritual of devotio, a solemn vow in which a Roman general sacrificed himself in battle to secure divine favour. Charging into enemy lines, he died a martyr's death. The story, whether true or not, electrified Roman morale. The Romans held firm, and eventually the Latins were routed. Meanwhile, a separate drama played out involving Titus Manlius Torquatus's own son. The younger Manlius had engaged in single combat with a Latin horseman, disobeying strict orders not to break ranks. Despite winning the duel, he was executed by his father to preserve discipline. These tales, woven into the Roman moral fabric, elevated the war into myth, But it wasn't myth that won it, it was logistics, discipline, and an evolving Roman system of integration. Over the next 2 years, Rome conducted a methodical campaign. It besieged key Latin towns, crushed pockets of resistance, and worked to isolate rebel cities diplomatically. In 338 BC, after victories at Pedum and Antium, the Latin League was dismantled completely. But Rome's real brilliance lay in what came next. Rather than impose a one-size-fits-all punishment, Rome innovated. It offered each defeated city a tailored status. Some towns, like Lanuvium and Aricia, were granted full Roman citizenship, integrating their elites into the Roman system. Others received civitas sine suffragio, citizenship without the right to vote, allowing them legal protections but no political power. Still others became municipia or allies with no formal citizenship at all, but were required to supply troops and pay tribute. This flexible approach allowed Rome to expand without overstretching. It diffused rebellion, offered incentives for loyalty, and slowly Romanized the Latin countryside. The Latin War thus marked the end of any notion that Rome was merely the first among equals in Latium. It was now the undisputed hegemon. The Latin League ceased to exist. Rome's road to empire was no longer a question of if, but when. And importantly, the war marked the moment when Rome moved beyond simply conquering and began absorbing, creating a political model that would fuel its rise across the peninsula. The consequences were immense. Militarily, Rome now had access to a much larger pool of manpower. The integration of Latin communities meant Rome could field armies that dwarfed those of neighbouring powers. This would prove decisive in future wars against the Samnites, Etruscans, and eventually Carthage. Politically, Rome began to resemble a federation more than a city-state, one in which citizenship became a tool of expansion. Cultural diffusion accelerated. Latin language, religion, and institutions spread, while Roman law crept into the local practices of its former rivals. But it wasn't all peaceful. Some Latin cities resented their subjugation, and unrest would flare up in later centuries. The social war of the 1st century BC, for instance, was rooted in long-term tensions, seeded during this very era. Still, the Roman model proved more durable than any rival. The victory over the Latins allowed Rome to stabilize its central position in Italy and set the groundwork for outward expansion. By the early 3rd century, Rome was entangled with the Samnites again, pushing into Etruria and colliding with Greek cities in southern Italy. The Latin War, though short, was a fulcrum, a lever on which Rome pivoted from a dominant city-state into a proto-empire. It taught Rome how to incorporate without assimilation, to conquer without annihilation, and to manage diversity through hierarchy. The war also revealed the maturing ideology of the Roman Republic. The idea that Rome was more than just a city. It was a mission, a unifying force ordained by fate and sustained through discipline, sacrifice, and order. And this ideology, forged in blood and policy, would guide Rome through the Punic Wars, the Macedonian conflicts, and into the era of emperors. In the Latin War, Rome didn't just defeat her equals, she transformed them into her citizens, her soldiers, and eventually her Romans. You've been listening to Short History Shorts audio. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow, rate, and share with your fellow history lovers. Until next time, where history speaks louder than images.